Here at Go Stargazing, we've noticed that our posts about spotting the Starlink satellites pass by have been really popular. We get a lot of comments on this controversial topic. Some are curious, some well informed, and some are plain wrong. There are also a lot of folks out there unsure of the timings or if and when they can see them from their location. So let's delve a little deeper into this in our next short video. We're going to cover what Starlink is, why we see it as a train of lights across the sky, what the purpose of these satellites is, who are behind them, and why it's causing a stir for both amateur and professional astronomers alike. Firstly, what are the lights in the sky that you're seeing pass by? Starlink are communication satellites for transferring internet data at high speed, and they're owned, launched, and operated by a company called SpaceX, who we'll discuss in a moment. The reason we can see them in the night sky is that, like so many satellites, they glint and catch sunlight and reflect that back towards the ground. This is why they're particularly obvious around twilight times, when it's dark enough to see them against the inky sky, but there's still enough sunlight for them to reflect back to us on Earth. There are over 9,400 satellites right now in orbit around the Earth, and this is for all manner of reasons, including telecommunications, military application, reconnaissance, weather forecasting, land use survey, climate change measurements, urban planning, mapping, GPS, and of course our favourite, space telescopes. Not to mention our largest man-made satellite, which is the International Space Station. Now this is the size of a football pitch, cost $150 billion, and has been inhabited by 250 people from 20 countries for almost 20 years continuously. So we've been putting things up in orbit since the Russians first launched Sputnik in 1957. Many of you will have seen the space station fly by after seeing it on a Go Stargazing post, and if there's not too much moonlight and you're not in a heavily light polluted area, you might see tens of satellites pass overhead in any given hour, just by laying on your back in the garden. A lot of our followers have been caught out by the satellites because they appear as a weird train in the sky, with one after another all following across the same path. If you're not sure what they are, it can be a bit spooky, or even make you wonder if you're witnessing an alien invasion. The satellites themselves are a flat, thin shape and pretty small, but they have a deployed fold-out solar panel. 60 of them at a time will take a ride into low Earth orbit on a Falcon rocket, and they're released from inside the nose cone of that rocket one by one. Not long after they've launched, they'll pass overhead in a regularly spaced train around 250 kilometers above us, and we get a lot of these in the UK because the rockets tend to launch from Florida and fly northeastward over the Atlantic Ocean. About 30 minutes after the launch, when the rocket is still deploying those satellites, this is often over northern Europe. Over time, the satellites jostle and move into their final planned positions to form the mesh of the Starlink network, and they're a bit higher up at this point, around 550 kilometers. Because here they're more dispersed, they don't tend to form as much of an obvious train, and they can be a bit dimmer because they're further away from us, of course. Since the satellites are designed for fast communication, they're deliberately in quite a low orbit above the Earth, so that the signals don't have to travel very far. Thankfully, this means they will eventually fall back down. The atmosphere just doesn't have a clear boundary edge where you suddenly go from being in air to being in the vacuum of space. Instead, the air just gets thinner and thinner the higher we go, until it more or less disappears. So being only a few hundred kilometers up, the Starlink satellites still fly through the odd gas particle, which slows them down over time. Over the years, this small but continuous decrease in speed means that they eventually undergo orbital decay and fall back to Earth. This is expected to take about 3 to 5 years, and so in 2025s, the satellites you've seen these past few nights will already have gone. So Starlink will not be a permanent bit of space debris. Being relatively small, it's unlikely that large bits of junk will be hitting the Earth when they do come back, but rather they'll just burn up high in the atmosphere, a lot like a shooting star. However, given the potential number of these satellites, we may be seeing hundreds of them burning up per week in just a few years' time. And it also means we'll be seeing a lot of rocket launches, not just to put the original network up in space, but also to keep that network maintained with new and replacement satellites. Starlink is a private constellation from US-based company SpaceX. This is a space launch company who in just 10 short years have pioneered reusable rockets, in doing so vastly reducing the cost of access to space. You've hopefully seen video of their Falcon 9 heavy rockets, two landing side by side on a launch pad in Florida, with a third minutes later on a drone ship in the ocean. SpaceX has been launching commercial and military satellites, as well as ferrying cargo under NASA contracts to the space station. They'll also be launching astronauts to the space station in their Crew Dragon capsule for the first time from US soil since the last space shuttle launch over a decade ago. Currently, the company is working on an even larger stainless steel rocket called Starship, and this has applications for lunar orbiting space stations, moon bases, and eventually plans for Mars colonies, which is the ultimate dream of billionaire founder Elon Musk. You might have seen Elon in The Simpsons, South Park, or even Rick and Morty cameos, or be familiar with his other companies such as Tesla, the electric car manufacturer. Besides Starlink, Elon is quite the divisive character himself, whether it's mocking Thai cave rescue divers on Twitter, dating Hollywood celebs, or getting high in podcasts. He has a cult following of detractors and mega fans alike, both of which seem to coexist on the Go Stargazing team. SpaceX advertises Starlink as their means of providing internet access for rural areas. Whilst in our towns and cities of developed nations we enjoy fibre optics buried underground, developing nations usually don't have the means for that kind of infrastructure investment. Meanwhile, rural and remote users are just not enough of a market for telecommunications companies to build expensive connections for a small number of customers. Being an omnipresent network above our heads, Starlink is perfect for this kind of user, whether this is a third world village, an oil rig, a war zone, a ship, or even an Antarctic base. One big market for Starlink could be investment banks. Increasingly, we're seeing trades in shares and commodities made quickly and automatically by computer models, with each bank racing the others to predict and beat price fluctuations. Using the very fast Starlink network with what they call low latency could be a serious boon for these kinds of companies. SpaceX apparently intends to use the profits from Starlink to fund development of their huge Starship rocket. Elon's ambitious plans to use this rocket for high-speed flights between major hub cities such as London, New York, and Hong Kong, kind of the way Concorde used to operate. He also aims to reduce the cost of space travel and enable Moon and Mars colonies, as well as new economies such as mining out there in space. This is generally seen as a good thing. Making humanity a multiplanetary species can keep us safe from extinction events such as pandemics or meteor strikes, whilst reducing the cost of access to space can revitalize sluggish Western economies who have good space technology bases, as well as empowering poorer nations. Mining in space could save us from spoiling the planet by depleting our finite resources as the world population continues to expand. Whilst the satellites themselves only stay up for a few short years, the chance of space debris of course increases with every bit of technology we put into orbit. The more cluttered space becomes, the more chance a satellite has of crashing into another one. And quite famously, a recent Starlink satellite had a 1 in 1,000 chance of colliding with the expensive European Space Agency satellite known as ELUS, which had to fire thrusters to move out of the way. A big concern is known as Kessler syndrome. This is where two satellites crash into each other, creating a debris field, which in turn hits other satellites, and so on and so forth. A chain reaction of devastation which devastates most satellites and trillions of dollars worth of equipment, plunging Earth into a communications and GPS satellite blackout as it does so. Something a bit like that was seen in the Sandra Bullock movie Gravity, although it's not particularly realistically handled in that film. Satellites are well tracked for this reason though, and can often move out of the way in advance. There's also a climate change cost in launching all these rockets. Even though the rockets themselves are highly reusable, the engines tend to run on methane or kerosene. A Falcon 9 rocket launch accounts for about 425 tons of carbon dioxide release. However, all rocket launches this year worldwide we're still 40,000 times less contributive to greenhouse gas emission than our aircraft travel, and the increase in virtual meetings over internet enabled by Starlink could potentially offset this by reducing car and plane travel needs. The primary source of controversy with Starlink satellites is just that we can see them. Being in their low orbits, they can appear very bright in the sky, and being so numerous with the network completed, with tens of thousands of satellites planned, they could be quite the problem. In the not too distant future, it might be impossible for anyone, anywhere on the planet, to look up at any time of night without seeing dozens of Starlink satellites racing across their skies. This is light pollution on an epic scale for every human alive, and many people see this as an act of extraordinary arrogance or vandalism on a staggering scale. For most amateur astronomers and photographers, this will ruin quite an expensive hobby, whilst for research astronomers, it can render their $100 million or multi-billion dollar telescopes pretty useless. At the moment, it's possible to plan our observations around the Starlink passes, or just to discard odd bits of dodgy data ruined by a satellite streak, but in the coming years, this will be pretty close to impossible to handle. In fairness to SpaceX, they have experimented with a DarkSat. This was a special satellite prototype painted with anti-reflection materials. However, in practice, most of the light is reflected from the solar panels, which you obviously can't paint black, and the satellite didn't actually appear any darker than any of the others. In future, the satellites might come with a little sunshade umbrella made of foam, but how effective this will be remains to be seen. At least the company is responding to negative community feedback. You can check to see if the Starlinks are passing overhead from your location at any given time by checking out the cool free website james.darpinion.com/satellites. Here you'll also find which batch of satellites you're looking at, where to look from your particular spot, as well as a handy guide to the weather, since of course you're not going to see them if it's too cloudy. If this little video has piqued your interest, the International Astronomical Union, yes, they of Pluto planet demotion fame, have an official statement on the matter. Or for a more layperson conversation on the topic, as written by a research astronomer about his concerns, you can check out the Forbes Magazine article, also linked below in the description. So what are your thoughts? Leave us a civilized comment down below. Is SpaceX vandalizing our night sky with these launches, or should anyone have the right to access space? Are astronomers being selfish in opposing Starlink, or are we protecting one of the few natural resources we've not yet ruined? Should we complain about satellites when there are so many up there already, as well as tens of thousands of aircraft streaking across the skies per day? And as people who already have good internet access, is it right to deny other people that resource? Is midterm damage to ground-based astronomy a necessary evil for paving a way to larger and cheaper space telescopes for our research, which are arguably much superior? And most importantly, having perhaps enjoyed watching the satellites pass overhead for yourself, do you now feel differently about them? Do they go from being a pretty novelty to a constant scourge? Don't forget to visit gostargazing.co.uk, an organisation promoting grassroots astronomy and dark skies for all. For the best times and places to engage with stargazing events in your area, follow our website or look at us on social media for regular updates.